You are listening to SPN, the Sports Podcasting Network.
من هناك لشوارشتايجر
ya lo hace, pierna derecha, directo al arco, golazo, golazo, golazo.
This is Soccer Today, live on SPN Radio, your new live show about the beautiful game in all its glory, with Duane, Rollins and Kevin Laramee. MLS, EPL, La Liga, Champions League, all is fair game. Powered by the Sports Podcasting Network. Visit us at sportspodcastingnetwork.com.
Kevin,
Yes.
another win for Milos.
Yeah, right. It's kind of interesting, and another problem for Messi.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that in a minute. I did want my tennis roots are coming out there. I wanted to give a little nod to Milos Raonic, who has made semifinals Wimbledon just before we went on air. So that's front of mind. But yeah, Messi is the topic of conversation today. It's actually usually, Kevin, I'm usually the first one up by a long time, but I fell asleep quite late watching a baseball game on my phone last night for some reason, and woke up late today. So you were the one that actually broke the news to me that he had been convicted of fraud in terms of his image rights, tax fraud and his image rights, and sentenced to 21 months in jail. But it is a suspended sentence, Lionel Messi, so he won't serve jail time. But God, that's got to be a bit of a kick in the pants, eh?
Yes, a lot. And, when you're not having necessarily the best couple weeks, just another layer on top of it. So I hope that Messi has some good friends that he could hang out now, because things looks a little bit gloomy for Messi right now.
Yeah, look, I mean, I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on the Spanish or Argentine legal system, but he basically is a suspended sentence, as I understand it, is that as long as he doesn't do anything further to make himself more into legal problems during this time, that jail time will never be served. It's just sort of there in case they don't behave well. That's how most suspended sentences work in most parts of the world. So, again, I think we should stress that he's very, very unlikely, or his father for that matter, are very, very unlikely to end up in jail. They claim, if you listen to the case, that it was ignorance, that what they were doing, which was essentially using tax havens, it's very Panama papery kind of, using tax havens to hide certain money from the authorities so they wouldn't have to pay tax on it relating to his image rights. It's probably the simplest way I can put it, and it's probably too simple, but kind of that sort of thing. They were claiming ignorance, that they didn't know that what they were doing was illegal. They were sort of just following the advice of probably their advisors. That's usually advice and advisors go hand in hand, right? Anyway.
Well, usually yes, but you know what? I have a feeling that one of the ramifications of this is not only the 21-month kind of probation for Messi. I have a feeling that he's been on the cover of FIFA, EA Sports for the last decade almost.
Yeah.
And you're talking about image rights, talking about safe haven tax places, talking about a guy convicted. Kind of have a feeling that in FIFA 17, it's not going to be Messi on the cover.
Yeah, probably easier that way. He has enough money to go around at this point in time too, so he's got to be careful and should probably just pay his taxes here. I don't want to get into a moral argument with that. I don't know enough details about exactly what he did or didn't do, or what he was accused of doing. I guess he was convicted of doing it, so I can say did in this case. So to really get into the the morality of it, but he's been convicted and now he has to live with it. And that was the Soccer Today question of the day, related to whether or not he would be affected by this, Kevin. And most people sort of said no. So that's something to go off of there. I don't know. Do you think he'll be affected by this? I don't know how anyone wouldn't be, in my mind.
Well, that's because we're not necessarily in a situation where we can buy the best lawyers and say, you deal with it. I don't want to hear about it ever again. That's a different story. We cannot afford in our daily lives to do those things like this, not just because of money, just because we're not Lionel Messi. We don't have that type of power of presence. Well, he has no charisma, I agree, but he still has a presence. So but what's for me, what's interesting, it's the whole ramification of the AFA right now. And when you know now, and with hindsight that we didn't 2-3 weeks ago, it's about the situation with money, the way players are treated by the AFA, the U20 situation, something we're talking about earlier on off air. It's kind of put things back in perspective and makes us understand a little bit why he reacted the way he did.
Yeah, precisely. And the AFA situation it's corruption, and it's graft and gone wild, which has created a situation in which the AFA is completely broke. They're not paying per diems. As I sort of speculated at the time, that might have something to do with so many people walking out. There's allegations that the U20 team is just being sort of left to figure themselves out on their own devices, have to buy their own food and things like that. Lots of problems going on in Argentina. And I have been actually working on trying to find someone to talk to us about that in the days ahead. But certainly that has to play a major role in the decision to walk away from the international game, along with the stresses involved with this, now suspended sentence that's hanging over his head. It does make me think that that speculation that we had just a week or so ago that Messi may be bluffing with this international retirement thing, I don't know anymore. I'm not sure whether he'll be around in Russia. If you'd asked me a week or so ago before the court case and more information came out on the Argentina situation, I would have said it was probably still 90% likely that he'll be involved in Argentina's team in Russia. Now I'm saying it's more like 50-50, I would suggest it. It might even
He
be
could be in
further.
jail.
Well, I don't think he's going to be in jail, but
I know, but we're being overly dramatic because that's what the Daily Mirror and sorts will say to sell newspaper, because it is a possibility, but it's further down the road if something else happens. But for now, still, Lionel Messi, 21-month suspended probation, and the headlines and the optics, something we like to talk about here sometimes, are not looking very good for Messi and even for Barcelona. Looking at that, now that's two big players with two similar situations with Neymar and Messi. Who's next?
Well, you never know. And look, Barca has always prided itself on more than a club.
Yeah, exactly, right? No, we don't like jersey sponsors. We're going to have UNICEF. And then they used we're going to move from UNICEF to a foundation. And then the same foundation, like, okay, we're just going to move to Qatar Airways. Never mind.
Yeah. Look, a lot of people that aren't Barca fans sort of laugh at that stuff, that they think they're hypocritical. And there's certainly, if you've ever been to the new camp and seen their club shop, they're not exactly against commercialism there. So their club shop is the size of some of our pitches over here. Put it that
some
way.
Of our stadium, basically.
Yeah,
well,
it's a mall.
It's like if you go to Estadio Azteca, the Club America Nike Town store. Jesus, two stories, and it's huge.
Yeah, no, that's the new camp store as well. Is anywhere in Barcelona you go, it's just Barcelona. As you right imagine, I've never been there before. You can get some Espinal stuff around, but by and large, that's sort of thrown in the discount bin where it's all Barca everywhere in that city. Yeah. It's really quite remarkable, and it's rare for a city that has two teams for one team to so completely dominate the other. I mean, usually second teams have a strong local following, but because of the history of those two clubs, one being sort of the club of the people rose up and ended up being the bigger club than the club of the establishment, which is kind of where it's worked with federalism and
it's kind of what Atleti's doing, kind of. We're trying to, at least.
Well, Atleti is that the dynamic there is more about working class, business class sort of thing, whereas in Barcelona it's about Catalan versus Spain, and there's a lot of complication there. And I don't want to pretend to be an expert on that, but that's kind of my understanding of it. So that's why Barca is sort of the spiritual club of the area rather than Espanyol, which is Real, right? Like they've got the designation on it and all that sort of jazz. And anyway, there's a lot of history there. And Barca does have a great, rich history that absolutely has earned a lot of that more than a club stuff. Modern Barcelona, I don't think has a lot to do with, the club that was standing up against fascism. I'm not too sure whether there's a direct historical connection there, but in terms of how they operate nowadays, I don't know. Anyway, and this sort of plays into that sort of reputational thing too, and it's going to be fuel to the fire of anyone who's not a Barca fan in terms of their rivalry, right?
No, exactly. And just to continue in the same vein, Tata, the coach of Argentina, the former coach of Argentina, as anticipated, has resigned yesterday, as coach of the AFA.
Exactly. And look, there's there's issues with the AFA that they're even talking about the possibility, if the government gets involved, and there's a possibility that might happen, that there could be a suspension for the AFA. So when we talk about Messi in Russia, he might not have a choice. If they end up getting suspended heading into the World Cup qualifying in the campaign in the fall, they might not make it. And that would be certainly something remarkable. I think that, we're being a bit prolific right now. I think that probably this stuff will work out. Argentina is too big of a property, and I use that term purposely in world football right now to not give them every opportunity to find their way into a World Cup. But nonetheless, rules are rules, and even the big can fall, as we've seen quite vividly in recent times. What's Sepp doing now?
Who? Exactly. Even Michel. Where's Michel? Michel, Théo Michel. Just that.
Exactly. So, yeah, fun stuff there. Look, that's moved. You were talking this about image rights, so I think that's interesting on that level too.
Because right now there's actually a contest, so that's the funny part. You think it's coincidental? Probably, maybe, but being and seeing things like I do, I like to draw parallels. I like to see things as a whole, and I notice patterns. It's not a coincidence that there's a vote this year with Eden Hazard and other players to land on the cover when there's that involvement with Messi, the image rights situation, and the fact that he's been on the cover for EA Sports for like 7 years. And it's probably the biggest image rights profile for an athlete like Messi, and that cover, it's the second most sold game in the entire world, talking about over tens and tens of millions of copies sold of that game, which is very rare because nowadays nobody buys DVDs, nobody buys CDs. People still buy games physically, and when you have your face on it, it's a lot of money generating, and it's a lot of eyeballs on your quote-unquote image rights.
Yeah, no, for sure. And look, a lot of thought goes into who goes on those boxes. And obviously Messi has been the vision of the face of the game worldwide for a few years. But he's turning 30 this year. Not to say his talents are diminishing really that strongly, because they clearly are. But that said, video game industry is a youth-oriented industry, and they may be looking to move on. I'm sure Neymar is who they'd want on there, but he's got his own problems right now. So absolutely, they're going to be looking at younger players, at players that are part of the next generation, and so on and so forth. And they probably are looking to move on. But the other part of that, sort of that double entendre in terms of image, is how does this affect Messi's overall image or in the general public? He was always kind of seen as squeaky clean. Now, do people maybe view him differently because of this? They view him as someone that's not really above and beyond.
Let's just remember facts, Duane. People think he's squeaky clean because people, let's not face it, let's not lie to each other. He does have a marketing and image controlling people that does that for him. You remember many, many years ago when he was a young lad coming in through the development system and there was questions about his age, there was questions about his upbringing, where he's coming from, about everything. We all forget about that, but those were questions and were doubts that existed in the past.
Yeah, exactly. This is a story that will be ongoing, and will it affect his play on the pitch this year? As I said earlier, I don't know how it couldn't in some level, but then again, this guy is an immense world talent, arguably the best finisher that the game has ever seen. I don't know if he's the best player, but I think he's the best finisher.
That clinically, yes, I think you're right. That just the way to just beat the keeper in any situation. On a one-on-one situation with the keeper,
in the Copa final.
Yes. Well, not talking about on spot. On a run of play, I'll take him over anybody against the keeper probably any day.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, so he'll find his way. I mean, even if you lose 5% of his abilities because he's distracted by legal problems, he's still going to be the best player in the world in his overall game, and certainly the best finisher in the world. So it does sort of add an intrigue to their season. The other side of this, and then we're going to take a break because we got a good interview coming up that we're going to run in a second, is whether this will affect his ability to move, or whether this might even make him want to move, because there's a lot of people that thought that this is a player that clearly was going to spend his entire career in Barcelona. I'm wondering now whether he might view a change of scenery as something that might help him revitalize himself and sort of move away from the problems that he's having right now.
Or even Duane, but to cement his legacy, people are talking about that he needs to move to show that he can do the same outside of the Liga.
Yeah, I mean, that's silly talk in my mind,
yes,
but regardless, that's certainly the rainy Tuesday night in Stoke talk does remain. It's kind of become a meme now more than an actual argument.
To go to Stoke?
Exactly. If Messi ever does go to England, I do hope that they do schedule a game against Stoke on a Tuesday night and that they just make it rain somehow, because then he can score a hat trick.
You don't have to make it rain, Duane. You're talking about England here.
Yeah, it'll rain at some point during the game. It's Stoke on a Tuesday night. What do you expect? All right. Look, we'll have lots of time in the days ahead to talk about this further, but we have a great interview right now with Clare Rustad, Dr. Clare Rustad, who is a former Canadian Women's International Olympian. She's an analyst for CBC, and she's been an analyst for TSN, for CBC, for Sportsnet, for all the big players. She's one of the best voices in the game out there, a great advocate for the women's game, just a great, smart football mind. We talked to her about the women in the month leading into to Rio, and also about her experience as an Olympian. Let's take a quick break, Kevin, come back and have that interview.
You are listening to Soccer Today, live on SPN Radio. Visit sportspodcastingnetwork.com for more.
And welcome back to Soccer Today. Joining us on the line is Clare Rustad, the former Canadian Women's International and a great analyst that you'll see during the Olympic coverage. How are you doing today, Clare?
Not too bad, actually. Pretty hot in Toronto, though.
It is always pretty hot, but I'll take the hot over the cold, but that's a different topic for a different day. We wanted to have you on to have a conversation about the lead up into the Olympics and about your experience as an Olympian, because I think that's something that not many of us have had, obviously, and with the Olympics upcoming soon, we'd like to touch on that. But let's start with the Canadian women and just get your general thoughts on where this program is right now in the lead up to Rio. Obviously, they went with a younger lineup this time. They've sort of turned it over a little bit. What are your expectations of this team heading into the Rio Games?
Well, I think a lot of us in 2015 for the Women's World Cup when I was here in Canada were perhaps a little perplexed by some of the roster choices, and even a little perplexed by the fact that certain younger players weren't involved with that tournament. I think Janine Becky's the one that jumps out at everybody, but there were several others that I think could have easily made that roster. I think they were maybe, I don't know if it's more emotional choices, but Herdman had kind of stuck with a lineup that perhaps had its day in 2012 at the Olympics, and by the time they hit the World Cup, there were some players who just were not performing at that level. And I honestly, it's been a big jump since then. I'm actually really happy with the direction that he's taken. He hasn't added a ton of new players, but the players he's added are young and more dynamic, and bring a more varied skill set to the team, which I think is going to be really important. I think sometimes teams get in a rut when you have all of the same player playing on the team, right? When now that you have a lot of, you just really do have a varied viewpoint when it comes to playing the game. So I have higher expectations actually for them at the Olympic Games. With that said, a 12-team tournament is not an easy tournament to navigate. It completely depends on the way your group shapes up, and they're in a hard group. So it's going to be interesting to see how they deal with that. Teams like Australia are relatively new to the top 10, and yet I think could cause a lot of damage there. And the Canadians would be, I just wouldn't advise that they take them lightly at all. And then obviously being in a pool with the Germans, that's going to be difficult. So repeating a medal performance might actually be more difficult than I think a lot of people think. I, to be perfectly honest, would be surprised if they were able to repeat a medal performance. I'd be very happy about it, but I would be a little bit surprised. But I do think that he's made positive strides towards his roster choices, bringing in some of the younger players, particularly in the midfield and up front. That's been a big positive. I think we saw that particularly in the second game against Brazil of their most recent friendlies in Ottawa. It was much better. Bringing Fleming into the midfield really opens things up.
You talk about bringing the young players in, but obviously those of us who watch the program and the fans of the program want to talk about some of those players that have become their heroes, become the vision, the face of the program over the years, and none more more than ever than Christine Sinclair. And I want to talk about her briefly before we sort of move to the future. What is her role now with this team? She's obviously slowed down a little bit, although she's an immense talent, and we're not taking that away from her. But what kind of role can she have with this program, both at Rio and moving forward, in your mind?
Well, prior to England's abrupt exit from the European Championships, I would have perhaps suggested that she could kind of take that, not necessarily the role that Wayne Rooney played in that tournament, but the role he kind of plays in his club football, which is where he's kind of a little bit more of a withdrawn striker. And she might be able to take over that role because, like you said, she has slowed down a little bit, right? I mean, her speed was always something that kind of one of the things that defined her as a player, but removing her completely from that front three, front four would I think be a bit of a mistake. I've had some people say, well, what if she takes over a defensive midfield role? Well, then you're completely taking away her main talent, which is finishing. So potentially bringing her in as a withdrawn striker. I mean, I think she can still play that target role very well. And I think that this team doesn't fall into the trap that the 2015 team fell into, which is get into the final third and then just hit it at Christine's knees. And give everything to her. It doesn't matter what, just like the goal was get in the front third, panic, and give the ball to her. And I think this team has a bit more creativity, like the current roster has a bit more creativity, and they're able to utilize their other attacking players a lot more. But for her, yeah, it may be playing a bit more of a withdrawn striker role. I'm not really sure what he's going to do, to be honest. I don't think she's quite at the stage that Abby Wambach was at in the World Cup in 2015, where Jill Ellis had to finally just sit her down, which ended up really benefiting the U.S. team. I don't think she's quite at that stage. I think her presence on the field is still really valuable for that team, and I think that her finishing ability is still there. I'm not actually sure what he's going to do. He really does seem to like this 4-3-3 kind of lineup, which works well for the remainder of the personnel that they have. But if she is playing in that striker role and doesn't have the speed that she used to have, she can sometimes not be quite as dangerous as you might like getting in behind players.
Claire, we are a day and a year removed from the final of the Women's World Cup. What was Canada's legacy with hindsight of this World Cup? Is it Kadisha Buchanan a little bit better infrastructures, or have we missed the boat on keeping some legacy, at least from this tournament?
Well, I think the legacy might go beyond the players on this team and this team as a whole. I think that part of the legacy of that World Cup was more in terms of bringing people out to watch. I was pretty impressed with the fans who came out and the number of fans who came out in a variety of cities. And I think that's more part of the legacy of not just keeping the women's game in the public eye, but keeping Canada soccer in the public eye. You can see that kind of carry over. I'm not saying the World Cup's responsible for the huge crowds for the men's team, but in a sense, just having more tournaments like this and having more games on home soil does provide an outlet for Canadian soccer fans, and I think it has contributed to the fact that we now see sellout crowds for national team games at BC Place or in Toronto, and it is very exciting, and it does seem to have sustained itself about a year out. So that's one of the main legacy components I think of. I mean, the legacy thing that I hope comes out of that World Cup is more of a focus on development of younger players. I mean, I'm not saying we can just kind of forget about this team entirely, but really the focus needs to be on kids who are still malleable. So that's in that, 8 to 13-year-old age group where you can really develop their knowledge of the game, you can develop their skills, you can develop their sense of the game. And if you look at countries, I mean, the one that's in everybody's eye right now is Iceland from the European Championships. So they decided about 10 years ago, hey, we're going to make our program awesome. And they made sure that every coach that coached youth soccer was licensed. They poured a ton of money into it. They built facilities that were applicable to their climate, so they were able to play year round. And they really focused on it. And that's the legacy part that I really hope grabs hold and sticks in Canada. It takes a bit of a long-term view, right? It's not going to change from the World Cup to the Olympics. Like, we're not going to see a huge difference in this team because of development in just a year. That's something that we have to be willing to look 10 years into the future, 15 years into the future, to wait for those kids who are being trained now make it to the national team level. So that's partly that patience for waiting for that to happen is something that I think lacks a little bit, not just in Canada. It's kind of like a North American thing. Not really willing to wait for all of that stuff to happen. You know, your team doesn't do well, so you fire the coach. And that seems to be the most obvious solution to the problem. And yet the solution to the problem is we just need to be a bit more patient.
You mentioned the United States a little bit earlier. If we're looking at their tournament in 2015 and their state now, it was the announcement to the world of the Carly Lloyd and Alex Morgan stepping up and announcing themselves to the world that this is our team. What does Canada have to do to have those type of players going forward for the new generation? So maybe it's a little part of that development as well. In the age of, you mentioned 8 to 13, I'm thinking about the 15 to 20, where you have teams like the Laval Comets and the Quebec folding last year because of they didn't have a place to play. What's the next level? What's the next step for the game in Canada?
Yeah, I mean, we have a bit of a unique environment for those older players, like you said, those kind of teenage, late teen players, and in Canada, and part of it is, you know, focused on getting an NCAA scholarship, right? So you can get 4 years of relatively high level training, and that's often the focus for a lot of players, although I wish more players would also consider Canadian universities, because we see a lot of young players who are so just hell-bent on getting an American scholarship, and they end up down in the States and not playing very much when they could have gone to a Canadian university and really had a lot of playing time, which for their overall development and as a player would have probably been better for them. So I really do wish more players would consider Canadian universities. But yeah, for those teenage years, it's really just about playing more, and I don't really know what the solution is for the clubs that end up folding. I think it's sad, because what we do need is players in an environment where they're training at a high level for the majority of the year, if possible. So you're right, that is a bit of a gap. I mean, I think the focus still does need to be on kind of starting from the younger ages and working our way up there, but there is a bit of a gap there. I mean, do those players play with women's teams? And you have teams like Vancouver Whitecaps no longer has a women's team. I think they're actually maybe in the works of trying to bring that back, but you see teams like that folding. So it takes away that high level training environment in a lot of areas for players about that age, or even kind of in their early 20s. So, I mean, the NWSL has helped, although that typically applies more to players who are already in the national team pool, or in and around the national team pool. And I'm not really sure what the solution is there. I mean, I could say, yeah, throw money at the problem, better funding, keep these clubs alive, but I'm not necessarily sure that that's the solution.
One of the criticisms of both the men's and the women's program in Canada is that once you make the club, that it's hard to get taken out of the club, and it's hard to break into the club if you weren't in the club, if you follow what I mean. Like, once you get in that stream, it's hard for an outsider to break in. Is that a fair criticism of the program on both sides of the gender divide in your mind?
Well, having been out of I would have said yes. In a way, back when I was playing, it was a little bit hard. I mean, I was out of the program from the 2003 until 2008. And so, I mean, having already been in the program, I guess I wasn't really breaking back into it or anything like that. But I'm actually, I mean, having been out of the program right now, I'm not actually really sure what that environment's like. What I do know is that the positive steps I see is more investment and more attention paid to the youth national teams. So there's under 17 national teams, under 20 national teams. So there's more opportunity there for the younger players. And I do know that John Herdman is often very heavily involved with both of those programs. And then also seeing kind of more regional camps happening as well. So, I mean, part of it is, I'm not going to play we're a big country, that's part of our problem thing. But there is kind of a geographical component, right? If you live in a really small town in the middle of BC, it's going to be challenging for you to get to some of these identification camps. and it costs a lot of money to do that. I know that, but the fact that there are more regional things happening, and that there are more youth national team events, having under 17, under 20 World Cups is fantastic. And a lot of the players who are on the full team right now, or the senior team right now, have a lot of experience in under 20 and under 17 World Cups. So how hard it is to break into that club, it's a hard question to answer. I mean, the other thing too is that different coaches look for different things in players, right? I mean, Pellerud was looking for a completely different player from what Herdman is looking for. So that also sometimes plays into it. But yeah, I'm not really sure I know necessarily with this particular team environment how hard it is to break in. I mean, I think we all saw that that he really does like, I know that Herdman really does like to stick with certain players, right? Like he does seem to kind of like keep certain players around when we're all thinking, why can't we move on from this? But I'm not necessarily sure that speaks to the culture for the entire team.
I want to go back to something that you said in your answer to Kevin, and it sort of speaks to the lack of playing opportunities for young women, especially once they finish their university time. There's no NWSL team in this country right now. They do fund 16 players, up to 16 players. I'm wondering whether you look like teams like TFC and like the Impact that don't have a women's program attached. They have a lot of women's fans, but they don't necessarily invest any money in the women's game. Do you think that they have an obligation, that they should have an obligation to maybe to invest on the women's side of the game?
Yeah, I kind of do. It really does make sense. And I mean, well, I'm not sure if we're still calling it Canada's Soccer Stadium in Toronto here, but I mean, you can't really call it that at one point and then not really invest in the women's game. So I do think there's a bit of an obligation there to at least pay attention to the women's game, if not get a women's program started, and get it. I mean, that would just, I've been saying that, I mean, we say it on the men's side too, right? I mean, if you can get a Canadian league started and get people kind of training in their hometowns, or at least in their home country, you can get them identified more, get them kind of closer to the coaching staff, and get them playing more often and on a regular basis together. And hopefully that's something that at some point can happen for the women's players, because they do end up a little bit scattered. You get some women's players playing over in Sweden, England, all over the place. And if you have them in the NWSL kind of training, similar teams, but also with each other, or at least in part with each other, and competing against the American players that they're going to see quite often, I think that actually benefits them. So, yeah, I mean, it would be great if the MLS teams in Canada got women's programs started. That would be awesome.
All right. I want to turn the attention, because you're an Olympian, and that's something that very few people have had the privilege to say. And we're a month out of the games now. Can you just sort of go back in time to a month out of Beijing for yourself and tell us what it's like in that lead up? What emotionally it's like, what pragmatically it's like in the month before you're about to leave for an Olympic Games?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. A month before we left, that was when the roster announcement was made, which I think is about similar for this go around as well. They made the roster announcement about a year or a month in advance. So, I mean, the team had already been together they'd actually been together for longer than I was with the team. They were together for the World Cup prior to that, the 2007 World Cup. And then I kind of came in just leading into 2008. So we've been together for a while. Everybody living in Vancouver and kind of in a residency camp. So the month leading up to it was basically, I mean, the main thing that really changed was making the roster announcement. The roster for the Olympics is slightly smaller than for some other international tournaments. So, that was a pretty exciting moment. But it's funny, the Olympic Games, everyone's like, oh man, it must have been just crazy being there. Well, the Olympics is a weird tournament for soccer, because you're almost never in the city that's hosting it.
Yeah.
So for us, that was the Beijing Games. Our first two games were in Tianjin, and we flew into Beijing briefly for our third game, and then left to go to Shanghai for the quarterfinals. So we didn't actually spend a ton of time in Beijing during competition, or in the Olympic Village during competition. And you're also pretty isolated, or maybe insulated is a better word, from the remainder of the games, because you're focused, and it does feel like any other tournament when you're there. And when you're at home watching the Olympics, the second Canada wins a gold medal, and you're watching sports you never knew existed, let alone thought you'd be interested in. And it's not really the same when you're there as an athlete. You're really kind of focused on what you're doing. So that part was a little unusual, but I mean, the part that's so cool about it, when we were in Beijing for the third game is, everyone's getting up at 7 a.m, going to eat. There's boxers outside sparring in the courtyard between buildings, wrestlers going for runs in just uncomfortable looking sweatsuits trying to make weight. And that's kind of the cool part is that you realize that it's actually not just a soccer tournament. There's something bigger going on, even though you can't really let that take your focus away from what you're there for. So it is a pretty unique experience. And I mean, the sad thing about us going is that because our first two games were in Tianjin and actually started before the opening ceremonies, we didn't actually get to go to the opening ceremonies, which I think might have made it feel a little bit different. We watched it on TV in the end in our hotel. It's a very unique experience. And it's one of those things that I came straight to Toronto after that for like my first day of med school, like closing ceremonies, flew to Toronto next day. And it definitely took a few months. I mean, it was myself and one of the women's rowers. We were both in the same med school class. And it definitely took a few months for me to for that to really settle in about, oh yeah, I did that before I came here. This is crazy. And it was a bit of an abrupt turnaround. So, it's a very exciting thing to be involved in. And the fact that it's so many different sports in one event is really, really cool. And you can take a lot of inspiration from the other sports too.
Do you have one memory that sticks with you that maybe is Olympic focused rather than soccer focused from your time in Beijing, or was it just a blur?
Well, no, I think that's what it is. It was seeing people, preparing in the Olympic, like in the courtyard. That's the one thing that sticks with me is going outside and seeing boxers from like 4 different countries all kind of sparring in the same courtyard with their coaches. It was one of those really kind of cool moments where you realize that, the training just really never stops. So that was one of the things that I really remembered. And then the other thing was, the closing ceremonies. The men's rowing team the men's eights, I think, had won a gold medal that year, and they were nuts. And we were in the tunnel going into the closing ceremonies, and they had started a really loud version of Alouette. I don't actually know the name of is there like a name to that song?
Alouette, Gentille Alouette. I don't know the name of the song, but I can gladly sing the song.
I can sing it, right? So they had started this very, very loud version of that, and it had like the entire Canadian team singing along to it. It was pretty cool.
All right. Well, I hope you enjoy the real games. You'll be watching them closely, we know, and we appreciate your insight as always. Thanks for your time today, Claire.
Yeah, no problem.
Hey, it's Kevin of the Sports Podcasting Network. On SPN, on top of What's the Score, the Sports News Quiz, you can find a plethora of great sports podcasts. Hardwood Radio, Gridiron Radio, Sports, It's in the Game, Scuderia F1, the second most listened to F1 podcast in the whole world, Soccer Today, live radio shows like Open Lines After Dark, MLS Postgame Show, Two Solitudes Soccer Podcast, Off the Woodworks, and much, much more. All that on the Sports Podcasting Network.com.
I looked it up when she was doing the interview there, Kevin. It was in fact the men's eight that won gold medal in Beijing, so they likely were the Alouette culprits.
Yep, exactly.
There you go. Thanks for Claire for taking some time. Dr. Rustad there. She's a doctor, so we should give her that respect too. But great analysis, great analyst, great analysis all the time. She's one of my favorite people to listen to talk about the sport. Doesn't matter what gender, doesn't matter what competition. When she's on TSN, CBC, she just has a lot of great insight. So I recommend her whenever she's on the platforms. And her and Daniel Squizzato, they have a podcast together too called The Canadian Soccer Experiment. So check it out too. Kevin, I wanted to take it this direction. The one glaring thing that came out of that interview for me, and this is a topic that's been a bit of an issue for me for a while that I brought up a few times, but I thought that it was interesting that she agreed with me, because you always like it when people agree with you.
And it doesn't happen often.
Maybe the MLS teams have an obligation to support the women's game. They take a lot of money from women's fans. They suggest that they are like the teams of Canada, that they're representing this country in the sport and so on and so forth.
Yep.
But yet TFC and Montreal have no women's program whatsoever. Vancouver is a very limited one right now. Your thoughts on that idea? Not necessarily NWSL. They don't necessarily have to go that level. I'd like that. I think at least
his team.
something.
Yeah, at least just an outlet, right? But I agree 100% with you. I just don't like the way we say it. It's not just for the women's game. It's for the game as a whole. It's one of the only places left to grow the game in itself is on the women's side. And I think that's where we have to focus as well eventually, because it all blends into me. It's all the same thing. And that's eventually the way everybody will look at it. But to grow the game, it's one of the only places left that the game can be grown. It's coming there. So no, I have to agree that at least something needs to be done eventually. Like if there's a provincial or region-wide higher level women's league, I think a team that is part of the system of a pro team like Montreal, Toronto, and maybe Vancouver with the comeback of one could be what's needed to have that outlet, because we talked about the Laval comments to that, how it's a shame that they had to fold because they weren't granted permission to play in the UWS, the United Women's Soccer League, a new league that's starting in the United States. They weren't allowed to play there, and they had no other outlet, and they were left a couple months before the opening of the season with no place to play and with no other choice but to pack up shop. So now I think they do have a certain responsibility, or at least if you want to grow the game and continue what you say you want to do. Well, Montreal never talked about it, so for them it's not something that they ever approach. But we have the PLSQ that's looking and working, and now it's actually a plan to have a women's league, just like Ligue 1 Ontario. Hey, I said it this today. So that's what's interesting to me, and maybe that's the route. If there's a PLSQ team, maybe the league, on the women's side, maybe the Montreal Impact have the responsibility to have a team in this league. If you're looking about Ligue 1, I think maybe Toronto needs to have a team in this league.
Yeah, look, there are people that strongly resist that idea. I've had this conversation with my Manchester United fan friends out there, but United famously doesn't have a women's program, whereas most of the bigger clubs in the UK, in England, I should say, have women's programs at this point, right? Including Manchester City, which has spent a great deal on their women's program. So I sort of tease them, not even tease them. I kind of strongly suggest that it's not really right of them to not have a women's program at all. And they would disagree with that. And I'm bringing it to United to take it away from Canadian rivalries here for a second. Is there an obligation? Is there an ethical obligation because you have women's fans, female fans, because you want to grow the game that way and commercially take advantage of that market? And there is a massive market and a growing market of female fans in the sport. See, I tend to think there is. It's more of an ethical question than it is sort of they have every right to not, but I think that they're wrong not to, if that makes sense, right? Like it's kind of one of those questions. And when it comes to Major League Soccer, I just think it's short-sighted to not at least have some kind of outreach on the female side. I go to Kia quite a bit through my Ligue 1 work. So the Kia training ground in Toronto, and it's a beautiful facility. It really is. I mean, people kind of think that they may be talking out their butt when they talk up how good that facility is, but no, it's remarkable, the stuff they have and the resources they have up there. And it's unfortunate to me, although they have shared it with the Canadian women's program at times when they've played in Toronto, but it's unfortunate to me that girls in the GTA don't have the same access to that kind of high-end technology, high-end sports science that is happening up at the Kia training ground that boys do. And to me, it's short-sighted.
Yeah, to be fair, if they're at that opportunity, it costs thousands and thousands of dollars on the private side of things to get those training opportunities. So, no, you're absolutely right. I think it's necessary. If you're looking at the whole academy's prospect of those teams in MLS, Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver, especially Montreal, Toronto, they have almost a complete pyramid on both Well, they do actually have a complete pyramid on both sides. So you're looking at the only part missing of that pyramid. It's a women team. And if you're looking at the women, what they can benefit from a young age to a pro age in that pyramid, in that training environment, and with the infrastructures and the attention to details and the lifestyle of a pro in those environment, and would generate better soccer players. And in the long run, it will benefit, of course, the national team, the game as a whole, because if the national team is bigger, it reaches more people, it catches the attention of more people, generate more attention to the sports, generate more sponsors dollar, which in turn gives more money grassroots. So it's all a cycle that needs to be worked on.
Yeah, look, final thought on this. We do need to take a break, but I think that, you get into this club country kind of thing, and there are people out there that quite strongly will argue that the clubs have no obligation whatsoever to grow the game on a national level. And there's some truth to that. Their only obligation is on their own market, their own club. However, I think that it's short-sighted to not reach out and not have a female side of things, because even on a club level, there's a true growth and I hate this term, and everyone hates this term, but it's a term that's real: branding. It helps your branding in your market. It makes you a more established part and a more established top end of the market. I'm just going to talk TFC for a second here. There are still people that resist TFC in the Toronto market because they resent them. They think that they have sort of parachuted in, that they don't necessarily play well with others, that they're not even on a development level doing the top job in the region. You're talking about rivalries with clubs like Sigma and others, that they'll look at TFC Academy and say, like, look, we're doing it as well. So why are they getting all the attention, all the glory? If you add a female team to that, if you added an NWSL side to that, that's going to just more greatly solidify you as the top end of the pyramid in the region. Everyone's going to look at you without questioning whatsoever that you are the top dog. And if you are the top dog on the female side and the male side, then all of the best talent is going to start coming through you, and it's ultimately going to benefit your male club as well, in my mind. And you look at the success of the Pride in Orlando in their first season. You look at the success of the Thorns in Portland in sort of establishing that brand as the biggest soccer brand in their market. To me, that's something that the MLS clubs in Canada are missing out on by ignoring the female side of the game, Kevin.
Yeah, and same for the clubs in the States that don't have a NWSL affiliate or just outright same owners.
Let's take a break. Come back. We'll have some bits and bites, a little USL talk to end the show.
You're listening to Soccer Today on SPN Radio. You can find the on-demand version of this very show on iTunes, Stitcher, Feedburner, Podbay Player, Podbean, anywhere you get your podcasts under the Sports Podcasting Network feed. Subscribe to our YouTube page to make sure you never miss a live show talking about soccer today, the MLS postgame show, open lines after dark, 5 rings daily during the Olympics. Make sure you subscribe and give us a follow on Twitter at SportsPodNet, and like our Facebook page, facebook.com/Sports Podcasting Network.
All right, not a lot of time left today. 10 minutes left in the show. We do have a couple bits and bites items. We want to talk a bit of the USL, and when this show, as we've said a couple times already, gets going regularly, and this show is the first one that's we've ignored the Euro today because we talked a lot about it, and what more are we going to say about a semifinal that's going to happen in a few hours' time? We'll obviously talk a lot about it tomorrow, but this is kind of what the show is going to look like moving forward in the days ahead, and you'll also have days that we will designate for our specific shows. So like Wednesdays, I think will be USL Wednesdays, right, Kevin?
Yep, USL Radio Wednesdays. We'll have like Two Solitudes Mondays, and with, of course, an eye outside for transitioning to be able to do all the shows live here on SPN Radio.
Yeah, and the Soccer Today brand name will be on top of all of them, but they'll also release on their own podcast streams. That's kind of the idea to go here, because there's only so many hours in the day, and unless you guys really start to hit that Patreon heavy.
Exactly. We haven't mentioned it in a while. So patreon.com/Sports Podcasting Network. That's Patreon.com/Sports Podcasting Network. anything help. $1 a month goes a long way.
All right. And we'll continue to talk about that in the days ahead. And we might have to have a marathon session where we put a figure out there that we need you to meet at some point. But I'm not going to belabor that right now. What I'm getting at is that if you want more than 5 shows a week, you're going to have to help us. Anyway, moving on. Kevin, one big major point. This we are in Canada, and Tiba Hutchison is a story that we follow quite closely. There was an author of €3 million rejected. That was West Ham. Went Bastikas. They offered them $3 million for Tiba. Bastikas has turned them down. He's a key player for them. They are in the Champions League next year. So if Atiba does not move on, it's not the end of the world. He will play some Champions League football. That's a good thing. He'll get some exposure there. But I think most of us kind of would like to see him in West Ham. I don't know. That's a question. Would you rather him in the Champions League or would you rather him every week in the Premier League?
I think you nailed it. We just want to see him. So if there's a way to watch the Turkish Premier League more often than just on very bad streams, maybe it's fine. But for Besiktas, it is a top 3 club in the Turkish Premier League with Fenerbahce and Galatasaray. But Besiktas, again, Atiba is at the time of his career now that it's either now you either go with a bigger club or close to home with a big MLS club or whatever the case may be now, or you just continue and cement your spot with this club because this club does like the Atiba, and Atiba kind of become a kind of cult hero for the supporters, and the supporters are important in the Turkish Premier League. So it is interesting to the whole Atiba situation. Another situation that it's interesting, we talked about Maxime Tissot yesterday. Well, guess what, Duane? He is on his way, if not right now, to DC United. According to Nicolas Martineau of TVA Sport, he will have a tryout, and we'll see what happens with the DC United.
Yeah, it's interesting. I had a long conversation with Steven Sandor yesterday that unfortunately has got corrupted in the file. So
only the second time in 3 years? Not too bad.
Yeah, and it's my computer because Kevin wasn't on the line, so it's all me. But at any rate, he talked about Tissot a lot and about the importance of and the value of the NASL in the possibility of revitalizing these guys' careers. Canadian internationals, this was a key component, and I'm going to try and get Stephen back to sort of get that conversation at the very least happening because there was a lot of worthwhile stuff. So when it talks about Tissot and him in DC United, we all hope that he lands there. But if not, the viable options of the NASL, I think, are something that Tissot should look heavy at because you're looking at the success of Ledgerworth in Edmonton, De Jong now who's out of contract in Ottawa, and unfortunately they weren't able to solve that. You're looking at De Guzman extending his career, Nana Adekora revitalizing his career in Fort Lauderdale. There's been a lot of good stories coming to the NASL. So if Tissot can't land in DC, then I think there's going to be an opportunity for him to pick and choose between Edmonton and Ottawa, and that should be something that we look forward to. I have a lot of issues with Tissot getting released in Montreal. I don't quite get the move, but nonetheless, we'll see how it plays out.
Duane, it has something to do as well. What we talk a lot about the ceiling of the new generation that has USL to grow that the other generation didn't. I think it has something to do with this too. And if you're a team like Montreal that maybe doesn't have Tissot in the way they want to play, the way they're shaped going up to next year, have a spot for him, you're trying to maybe bring somebody else that would benefit from that experience. Maybe that's the thinking behind it. Mauro Biello was honest saying, look, we didn't have something planned for him next year, and we do appreciate all his service for our team, but look, if you're looking at the first generation of players homegrown from Montreal, we met Lefebvre, Tissot, those three, only one left, and there's only one playing, and he had an opportunity, and he ran with it. The other players, I'm not saying they didn't have an opportunity, but maybe not to the same extent, and they were not necessarily in the same position on the field where their needs were there at the same time as their fitness or their shape, and they were bounced around from position to position. So for Tissot, if he goes to DC United and gets pinpointed that position, make sure that he is played in ways that he can shine. You never know what's going to happen, and you don't have that hometown pressure that you do have. Is it something that's tangible, that's real? Hard to say, but it's something that we have seen in the past, players coming out of one of their home city and thriving outside.
Yeah, well, that first generation, as you mentioned, Bryce Alderson in Vancouver is no longer there. You're looking at, a lot of the guys that came into the TFC system that are just like Matt Stinson, guys like that had a cup of tea or whatever in MLS that are just on. They're playing wherever right now, Ligue 1 in some cases, University CIS in some cases. the left foot should keep Tissot around. You mentioned him. Actually, I should have mentioned him. He's also landed on his feet with a loan deal with Jacksonville in the NASL. So again, it sort of illustrates this value of getting regular playing time at that level might be more important than sort of sitting on a bench in MLS. And that's a question that Tissot is going to have to ask himself. If he doesn't think he's going to regularly play for DC United, would he be better off starting for the Ottawa Fury? That's a question that's legitimate in my mind.
Exactly. So there's no deal done now, but that's what the latest rumor. Another thing I wanted to mention, Duane, CONCACAF announced participating teams, groups, and schedule for 2016 CONCACAF Under-15 Girls Championship. It's important to me because it's one of the only trophies that Canada's defending on. And yeah, Canada's defending this. So it's a CONMEBOL and CONCACAF. There's scheduled to participate in alphabetical order here. So you have teams like Angola, Antigua, Barbuda, Bahamas, Barbados, Costa Rica, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Canada, Mexico, United States, Venezuela from CONMEBOL, Santa Lucia. So you get the picture. So that tournament will take place later. And it's interesting. You want to know more, just go to CONCACAF.com. But yes, it's the participating teams have been announced.
All right. We did want to mention the USL a little bit here. We haven't in recent days. I think one of the more interesting storylines over the past little while has been this Nashville expansion, which is getting a lot of play. It was on Extra Time Radio, for God's sakes. A lot of talk, a lot of chatter around Nashville, who are moving up from the fourth tier to move into this so-called third tier now. And I use that term so-called purposely because if you look at some of the expansions that USL is bringing forward nowadays,
Reno.
A lot of bigger markets, though. Nashville is a market that you would have thought would have been more NASL focused. San Antonio purposely moving down. It does beg that question about the quote unquote soccer wars and whether, the NASL is getting left behind. I have a lot of time for the league. I think it has its place, but this idea, if you have aspirations moving forward in a market like Nashville, you'd have to think probably does have aspirations moving forward, especially when you hear Don Garber talking about it's not Midwest, but it would sort of play into, it's kind of in between the Midwest and the South, right? Like it would kind of be a nice little segue team, especially if you get a St. Louis or something in there. It would sort of add to that area, that footprint MLS would have. So it's just interesting to me that a market like Nashville is choosing to invest at the USL level. And this is another example of a market that's that size that would normally be NASL kind of focused, that is going there probably in my mind, like Cincinnati, with something a little higher in mind down the road, Kevin.
No, exactly. Right now in the Eastern Conference, Louisville is dominating. We talked about a lot in MLS how nobody's really good in the Eastern Conference. It's the exact opposite in USL right now. 11 wins, 1 defeat, and 5 draws for Louisville. Only lost 1. They actually won Monday versus FC Montreal here in was in Louisville. So I know it was actually Montreal. So again, a tough season for the FC Montreal, but Louisville are really dominating the Eastern Conference with 38.6 points clear, top of the table.
Yeah, and Louisville is a program, again, that speaks to that. I've heard interviews with their mayor and that they talk MLS. They talk that's their aspirations. And it just speaks to this idea that the USL is seen, because of the cooperation they have with Major League Soccer, as the better launching board, which, probably doesn't irritate NASL, because there are a lot of fans in NASL that don't like MLS.
That is a true sentiment. But
yeah,
not just that.
Not all of them. You know what? And I suspect it's the minority, but it's a loud minority that think that. But yeah.
But Louisville is truly like a fringe type of city as well for Major League Soccer. We're talking about a type of city like Columbus. I'm sorry to compare the two cities. They probably hate me now in those two cities. But, the Columbus, the way they got into the league was, you remember all that contest in the 90s and all that. Louisville might be that fringe type of city. And before they can get into MLS, they have proven great atmosphere, great crowds. But that number of the crowd needs to get up to like Cincinnati level, but constantly like 20, 24. And then you can talk about maybe convincing MLS that you're quote unquote worthy.
Exactly. On the western side of the docket, it's 2 teams, including the Vancouver Whitecaps. And I think probably it would be worthwhile for us, Kevin, in the days ahead to get someone from the Whitecaps on to talk about the success they've had there. I'm trying to understand why the Whitecaps have been, and people in Vancouver will scream that this is because they're more competent and perhaps, but there's got to be some more factors at play in terms of what is allowing the Whitecaps to succeed on the Western Conference of the USL, whereas TFC2 and the Impact FC Montreal struggle. So we should probably explore that in days ahead, and maybe next Wednesday in our first USL Wednesday, we will explore the Vancouver Whitecaps FC2 success this year. As I said, the LA Galaxy are right on their heels, first place in the Western Conference. Sacramento, the perennial power there, in third. Kevin, any thoughts? Any quick thoughts on what makes Vancouver more successful than the other two Canadian entries in the USL?
I think we all know that they use it a little bit more close to what they used to be a reserve type of team than what FC Montreal and Toronto do. They more consider this the top level of the academy. It's the same and it's not at the same time. It's when you're using players, let's just talk math for a second. In your MLS roster, if you're using player from the 11th to 18th spot more with your USL team, but they're always with your A team, your first team, they don't necessarily have the same. Those two players come and like they practice on a higher level. They got those rhythm, they got the chemistry because they're always together, and then they come back and play with the two teams and they actually get results. And because of that, but is it beneficial for the younger kids of that program? We'll see in the long run. It's an experiment, and we haven't really get an answer truly after a year and a half in Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver side. And if you're looking at Seattle and LA, it's been 2 years and a half in that experiment. So we'll see later on which one was the best. Is it to use it at a reserve and put a couple young guys there and see if they progress playing with older players, or use it at the top team of the academy? And so far, Montreal, Toronto is the latter philosophy, and we've seen the result this year. Vancouver fits a little closely to the first one. So maybe that's the explanation here for the results.
Yeah, if you do look at it, and I ran the ages a little while ago, the average age of the Whitecaps too was about a year and a half older, to almost close to 2 years older than Montreal and Toronto. So that plays a role at this level.
That's the difference. 2 years is the difference between the top of like what you're 18, 19 with the academy, 20, 21 in the roster spot of 11 to 18 on the bench or close to the first team of MLS.
Yeah, it is an interesting question, and it's also interesting to me that Seattle went in their first year in Seattle 2, S2, sort of did the Vancouver model in their first year and then chose to drop down and do more of a Montreal-Toronto model in their second season. So that's interesting to me. This is a battle and a question and a debate that's not going to be settled for about 10 years. We're not going to be able to see what the better approach was until then, but certainly in terms of at the USL level, if you want to just have success for success's sake at the USL level, obviously Vancouver's approach is working better than Toronto and Montreal's, because Toronto and Montreal are amongst the worst teams in the league once again this year, Kevin.
Yes, they are.
All right. Let's call it a day on that. We're 2 minutes over now. So, Kevin, as always, say goodbye.
Stay tuned to the Sports Podcasting Network. Tonight's Scuderia F1 podcast, the second most listened F1 podcast in North America. And tomorrow, 11 a.m., Soccer Today. Until then, have a great soccer. You were listening to SPN, the Sports Podcasting Network. Visit us, sportspodcastingnetwork.com.